Welcome to the fifth in our series of reflections from the woodpile, where we are exploring the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew's Gospel. In our first reflection, we looked at the Beatitudes and how they invite us to encounter what is of true value, the expansive love and generosity of God. In the second one, we looked at being salt and light, and how we truly live as salt and light as we live in relationship with God and allow that relationship to transform us into people of hope and people of life and people of the kingdom of God. In the third, we explored how to fulfill the law. These passages ask us to love God with all of who we are and love our neighbours sacrificially and generously. The last time, we explored Matthew 5, verse 21 to 26, and how, as we understand the depth of God's grace to us and his forgiveness of us, that we are moved to forgive others and move from anger to love. We also thought about how these verses ask us to own our mistakes in relationships and to look to restore those relationships so that we may know God and reveal his kingdom. In this reflection, we're going to look at Matthew 5, verse 27 to 32. In these verses, Jesus talks about lust and divorce. Interesting. Let me read those for us now. You have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body goes into hell. It was also said, "Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. As with the previous few passages, these verses don't make easy reading. To hold them is difficult. And they also speak of taking extreme measures to deal with sin. But what really do they mean? Well, let's take verses 27 to 28 and 31 to 32 first, because they speak about relationships. If we look at verses 31 to 32, the context for what Jesus says is in a world where the woman in the marriage relationship was perceived, not by everyone, but it was a common perception. She was perceived as an object, a possession. So there was a really low view of women. And this was enhanced by the Jewish law, which in terms of divorce was also quite simple, in that it permitted a husband to divorce because of some uncleanness. Women, on the other hand, had very little power in this matter. At the time Jesus was speaking, marriage was a desperately insecure place for women because it was disposable. And also, if they were divorced, this had a really long-term impact on a woman's acceptability in society. But what Jesus asks for in these verses is to see women not as disposable, but as equals and as deserving of sacrificial love and respect, as partners, not possessions. He's also asking that love be worked out, that the pursuit of loving God and our neighbour with all of ourselves should be as important inside our marriages as anywhere else. We live in a world where we're presented in various places with the idea that disposable relationships and selfish ones are the norm and they're acceptable, and that the brief pleasure of a disposable relationship is what we should pursue. The perception is that this is a new thing, that this has only come along in the last 20 years or so. However, it's not the case. With the verses on divorce, we see that people have been pursuing disposable relationships for nearly as long as there has been people. In verses 27 and 28, Jesus is talking about lust. And he's referring here when he talks about lust, he's referring to dwelling on our thoughts and allowing them to take hold of our mind and to influence our sexual desires. And there's lots of ways that can happen. But when we look back to what Jesus spoke about anger, and also what it looks like to fulfill the law, again here, Jesus is asking us to see people in the way that he does, in the way that God does. Not as objects of lust to be taken advantage of, but as people deserving of love. Love that honours them and honours God. In both verses 27 and 28 and 31 and 32, Jesus is asking us to act with generous love to God and people. To not see relationships, and this includes friendships, and people just as disposable and for our pleasure only, but to love sacrificially and generously as Jesus did. As we look to love people, the question becomes, what does it mean for me to honour and love God and honour and love them? How do I, in the relationships that I have, how do I reveal the kingdom of heaven as I relate to people? That is the question. Jesus, in the middle of this, verses 29 and 30, also speaks about if our eye causes us to sin, we should pluck it out. Or if our hand causes us to sin, we should cut it off. He's not telling us to physically harm ourselves, but he is asking us to recognize the severity of sin in our lives, the damage that sin, when left to fester and grow, can do to us, to relationships. If we let anger grow, or we let lust grow, it entirely distorts our view of people and relationships. It is so damaging, it would be better for us to be without the thing that causes us to sin than to have it. This is a really important message. Sin distorts our perception of self and what it means to love God, and what it means to love ourselves, and what it means to love people. It can lead us into spirals of selfishness and being destructive in relationships. It can lead us away from where true life is and leave us pursuing cheap, unfulfilling alternatives. But here's the beauty of who God is, that even if this is where we find ourselves, he does not leave us. But he asks us and invites us to turn around and look at him again. And in doing this, we begin a process of being transformed through relationship with him. This is true for everyone. We all have things that we need to turn from. Dallas Willard, a famous Christian philosopher, calls it our distorted desire system. And this distorted desire system leads us to chase things that will not fulfill. And this is something that is true for everyone. We all have things that we need to turn from. And we all have things that we need to look to Jesus with. And as we do this, as we live in relationship with God, as we're exposed to his love for us, to his grace towards us, we discover life, we discover hope and generosity. And as we do, we are more able to reveal this to the world around us, in the relationships that we have, and in our view of others.